Of course, the Wild West was, for the most part, not all that wild. Our entire vision is more skewed by B westerns and dime novels than reality. But like anything else, there were times when truth was, well, more exciting than fiction. On April 14th, 1881, the rough and tumble boom town of El Paso, Texas, lived up to its reputation as the six-shooter capital of the world in a gunfight that's more exciting than anything you'll find in a Hollywood Western, even if it's not nearly as well remembered as the OK Corral. It is history that deserves to be remembered.
The website of the Texas State Historical Association explains El Paso is at the far western tip of Texas, where New Mexico and the Mexican state of Chihuahua meet in a harsh desert environment around the slopes of Mount Franklin on the Rio Grande, which has often been compared to the Nile. As they approached the Rio Grande from the south, Spaniards in the 16th century viewed two mountain ranges rising out of the desert with a deep chasm between. The site they named El Paso del Norte, the Pass of the North, the future location of two border cities, Ciudad Juarez on the south or right bank of the Rio Grande, and El Paso, Texas, on the opposite side of the river. The border was established by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, making Ciudad Juarez a border town. In 1850, a small settlement called Franklin on the north side of the river became what the Texas State Historical Association calls the nucleus of El Paso, Texas, and El Paso County was established in March. The town, however, remained quite small. The city of El Paso was incorporated in 1873, but in 1876 the city council was disbanded because of lack of interest. Wild West historian Fred Egloff noted in 1982 that prior to the arrival of the railroad, the town population was just some 500, and Mexicans far outnumbered Anglos. The proximity to the border was a point of tension. In 1877, a conflict over the possession of salt lakes at the bottom of the Guadalupe Mountains turned into a conflict between Mexicans and Anglos, resulting in a score of deaths, including the murder of a district judge. The border tensions would continue. As was often the case in the American West, the coming of the railroad in 1881 transformed the community, as the State Historical Association explains. Most authorities agree that the arrival of the railroads in 1881 and 1882 was the single most significant event in El Paso history, as it transformed a sleepy, dusty little adobe village of several hundred inhabitants into a flourishing frontier community. Egloff writes that by 1880 the population had increased to 700 and doubled over the course of the year. The boom brought, however, lawlessness rather than civilization. The Cincinnati Enquirer reported in April of 1881. Regarding the point of maintaining order, we saw yesterday a letter from Mr. E. H. Cowing, a former resident of Wyoming, written from El Paso on the 15th, which states, "We have been here but 3 days, and there have been 12 men killed in that time. I saw 4 shot yesterday. There's an army of desperados following the railroad construction that are the worst daredevils in the world." Ryan Heiser explained in Borderlands, a publication of El Paso Community College, El Paso for a time was nothing more than a lawless boomtown riddled with crime of all sorts, with gambling and prostitution as the epicenter of business in the town. Infamously known as the six-shooter capital, the murder rate was astonishingly high, almost out of control. Part of the issue was the lack of presence of law enforcement. As a 2001 issue of Borderlands writes, El Paso became a safe haven for all kinds of criminals. Refugees from both Mexico and the United States hid there, since the closest sheriff's office was over 15 miles away, and Texas Rangers showed up only now and then. Nearby Fort Bliss had its hands full protecting settlers from Indians. Attempts to bring the lawlessness under control were, well, inconsistent. The town council seemed for some time unsure whether to embrace the opportunities offered by the influx of gambling and prostitution or to try to take control of the town in the interest of encouraging future investment. A step towards order was taken in July of 1880 with the election of the first city marshal, John B. Tays, who had been a Texas Ranger who participated in the Salt War. Egloff writes that he received no salary, was expected to live off his share of fines assessed against offenders he arrested. He served as marshal from July to October 1880, but his tenure came to an end owing to a pothole. The El Paso Museum of History explains. It was poor city engineering that cost him his job as marshal. Tays had attempted to fill a particularly large street pothole with town garbage, and the results were less than desirable in the city council's eyes. He was replaced by his assistant, A.I. Stevens, who lasted just a month before being relieved for dereliction of duty. Stevens was replaced by George Campbell. Campbell had been a deputy sheriff in Clay County in North Texas. Came to El Paso in November of 1880 in anticipation of the arrival of the railroad, where Egloff explains he felt he could get in on the ground floor and build a prosperous future. Of Campbell's tenure, historian Eugene Cunningham wrote in 1982, "Nothing has ever been said that would put doubt on his personal bravery, but he was gravely handicapped for his impartial execution of a policeman's duties by a close friendship which is known as the sporting crowd." Like many other policemen in this condition, Campbell found it very difficult to police the town and make justified arrests without treading the toes of his friends, or, which is always worse, the friends of his friends. But that is not what would lead to the resignation of the town's third marshal in as many months. Egloff places the blame at the foot of El Paso's mayor, a prosperous businessman named Solomon Schultz, who had a reputation for taking advantage where he could. Egloff writes, the mayor was evidently using a similar technique on his city marshals. He would paint a glowing picture of the position and the opportunities it offered, but he would not provide pay. The Ashland Independent reported, he made many arrests, and always without harshness or use of any arms. The mayor, however, being a merchant, made his office subservient to his business, and either would not fine a Mexican or make the fine very light because he was courting their trade, and so likewise with the Americans. This was, of course, a problem, as Marshal Cunningham depended upon a percentage of fines as his salary. Egloff also speculates that Schultz expected Campbell to supplement his income by shaking down gamblers and prostitutes, something that he was too upright to do. In any case, the problem led to a confrontation between Campbell and the city council. Cunningham writes, in his turn, Campbell had a complaint. He thought that the arduous duties of city marshal were worth a good deal more than the council paid him. He demanded a raise in his salary, and the council took this as an excellent excuse for dispensing with his services. Campbell resigned at the end of December. This brought up an interesting issue. The position now devolved upon Campbell's assistant, one Bill Johnson, who Egloff describes as having a badly crippled arm and was known as the town drunk. Cunningham writes, so Bill Johnson was brought in and informed that he was city marshal pro tem, that he would thereafter walk and act and drink as such. He seems to have received the elevation very modestly, not to say indifferently. Certainly it made no difference in his conduct. What came next is a matter of dispute. Egloff writes that the impending resignation of the marshal set the town up for what was probably the wildest New Year ever recorded in any town in the Wild West. Word leaked out and was intentionally passed around that there would be no law enforcement on January 1st, 1881. Cunningham faults Campbell's friends, but Campbell's friends were annoyed by his deposition. He had been the sort of city marshal to completely suit them, and anyone could see that Bill Johnson was not apt to hold the office very long. If he should be replaced by a stranger, well, it could easily prove inconvenient. So get Campbell back his job, was the cry. The plan, Cunningham explains, was to show to City Council what a wicked town El Paso had come to be, how necessary it was that some strong hand grip the reins, how desirable that George Campbell be reinstated at the higher salary that he had demanded. Whether by a plot of Campbell's friends or simply the lack of law enforcement, pandemonium, Cunningham writes, broke loose. Egloff writes that within an hour or two into 1881, all hell broke loose in El Paso. The downtown section was lit up with gun flashes. Cunningham writes windows were smashed and doors were splintered, and property in general pretty thoroughly wrecked. Egloff notes that they placed marked attention in their pistol practice on His Honor the Mayor's store and private residence. While the falling out between the mayor and Campbell continued, eventually leading to Campbell threatening to shoot the mayor and the mayor filling out a warrant for his arrest, the town called on the help of a detachment of Texas Rangers to bring order, but it was only a temporary solution. Cunningham writes, Rangers could only be used in such a capacity for no more than an emergency. The town needed a marshal. On January 16th, they hired a man named Ed Copeland with a wage of $50 a month and $40 for a deputy. This seemed to be an insult to Campbell, as it proved that the council could indeed afford to pay the marshal a wage, but the council also included an ordinance that the marshal had to post a performance bond of $500. Copeland was apparently unable to and was dismissed. With little option, the council confirmed Johnson again as marshal. But the council was looking for someone else, someone who was without the connections that some insisted had resulted in bias by Campbell. Cunningham writes, the stage came in from New Mexico, bringing a blonde 6-footer with chin like a great rough-hewn oak block. Dallas Stoudenmire was born in Alabama, and though underage, had served with the Confederacy in the Civil War. The Texas State Historical Association writes, he arrived in Columbus, Texas about 1867 and reputedly killed several men. For a while in January 1874, he was a second sergeant in J.R. Waller's Company A of the Texas Rangers. He then lived briefly in the Panhandle before serving a stint as Marshal of Socorro, New Mexico. Weiser writes that his brother-in-law and El Paso, Texas resident Stanley Doc Cummings convinced Stoudenmire to accept the job position as town marshal of El Paso. He presented himself to the town council, where Cunningham explains even more impressive than his record was the presence of the man himself. He was lion like as his blue eyes turned slowly from one to another of the council. Stoudenmire was hired. While he was associated with several weapons, including a Colt revolver that had a sawed-off barrel for concealment, he was known to carry two nickel-plated Smith & Wesson 44 caliber pistols that he drew from his trouser pockets, which he had lined with leather for a quick draw. Thus he was called the two-gun marshal. His appointment would lead to confrontation quickly. The council sent the new marshal to collect the keys from Johnson, but Johnson proved uncooperative. Weiser writes, according to nearby witnesses' testimonies, Stoudenmire approached and asked the intoxicated Johnson for the keys. The drunk mumbled that he had to go home to figure out which keys were his and which were the city's. An impatient Stoudenmire again demanded the keys, though Johnson continued his delay. Living up to his tough and uncompromising reputation, Stoudenmire physically turned Johnson upside down and personally retrieved the keys himself, leaving the drunken former deputy marshal publicly humiliated. The website Legends of America notes Stoudenmire was wasting no time living up to his formidable reputation. Meanwhile, more trouble was brewing. The bodies of two Mexicans were discovered near a ranch outside of town. Apparently, the two had been tracking men who had stolen cattle when they were killed. A local rancher named Johnny Hale, a suspected rustler, was suspected. Hale was part of the sporting crowd, a friend of George Campbell. Hale was brought in by the Texas Rangers, and a posse of some 75 Mexicans was allowed into town. A deputy sheriff and former U.S. Marshal named Gus Crimcow was brought in to translate during the ensuing inquest. During a recess, Hale confronted Crimcow. The exact situation was, well, confusing. The Galveston, Texas Daily News reported that John Hale, who was said to be a bad man when under the influence of liquor, made an unsuccessful attempt to intimidate the new marshal, Mr. Stoudenmire, who entered on duty today. Hale fired at Crimcall, a policeman, and killed him, Crimcall firing at the same time at Hale and wounding him. Stoudenmire then killed Hale and a Mexican accidentally with the same shot. G.W. Campbell, a friend of Hale, attempted to draw his pistol and was mortally wounded by the marshal. But to underlie the confusion, the news also offered another account, saying that the conflict was because a dispute arose about those armed Mexicans between G.W. Campbell, John Hale, and Crimcall, a policeman. Hale covered Crimcall and shooting commenced. Hale shot Crimcall and the marshal shot Hale and a Mexican accidentally. He also shot Campbell. The San Francisco Chronicle reported that the fight was the result of a conflict between Americans and the Mexicans. The row became general and the bullets flew thick. During the melee, John Hall, mistaking one Crampton for a Mexican, shot and instantly killed him and was himself shot by an American. The town marshal, having tried unsuccessfully to quell the disturbance, took part himself and fatally wounded one Campbell and a Mexican. The Deadwood, South Dakota Pioneer Times wrote yet another account. Hale fired and killed John Crimpton, a policeman, who fired at the same time and wounding the new elected Marshal Stoudenmire and killing Hale and a Mexican bystander with the same shot. George Campbell, a friend of Hale's, attempted to draw his pistol and was mortally wounded by Marshal Stoudenmire. There is disagreement still today over the exact sequence of events, but it is clear that Hale fatally shot Crimcaw, although some accounts have him being drunk and using one of Campbell's pistols. And Stoudenmire, running towards the sound of the shots, shot Hale and an innocent bystander, and then he killed the former marshal, George Campbell. Exactly why is not clear. Egloff writes, based on Campbell's own account, that Stoudenmire first shot Campbell in the arm and then shot a mortal wound as Campbell tried to draw his revolver. Cunningham writes that Campbell had drawn his revolver and backed away, saying, "This is not my fight," and Stoudenmire, seeing him with his gun out, shot. Legends of America writes that Crimcaw, mortally wounded, shot Campbell in the wrist and toe, and Stoudenmire, seeing Crimcaw shooting, assumed that he had been shot by Campbell and responded. Several accounts say that Campbell, shot 4 times in the stomach, cried, "You big son of a bitch! You murdered me!" Hale and the unnamed Mexican bystander were dead. Campbell and Crimcaw, mortally wounded, died shortly after. Legends of America writes, 4 men lay dead in less than 5 seconds in a near comic opera gun battle. The gunfight was well publicized in newspapers in cities as far away as San Francisco and New York City and made Stoudenmire a legend. The confusing fight became known as the 4 dead in 5 seconds gunfight.
The gunfight was certainly proof that the Wild West could be quite violent, especially in a boomtown like El Paso, where rapid growth brought all sorts of social conflict and order was slow to establish. The conflict would go on. The drunk Johnson tried to get revenge against Stoudenmire, ambushing him with a double-barrel shotgun and proving what a town drunk he was by missing with both barrels. He was killed by Stoudenmire, but Stoudenmire was then killed a year later by another member of the sporting crowd who was exonerated by a jury made up mostly of his own friends. Who were the good guys and who were the bad guys? It's not really clear. Egloff and Cunningham disagree over George Campbell, with Cunningham describing him as a crony of criminals, while Egloff describes him as an honest lawman who was given a raw deal. Some describe Stoudenmire as a stout lawman who brought order to lawless El Paso. Others describe him as a tyrant who terrorized the city. Meanwhile, none of these names are nearly as well known as Wyatt Earp or Doc Holliday or Bat Masterson, and certainly the conflict was not nearly as well known as Billy the Kid's Lincoln County War, and the gunfight not nearly as well known as the OK Corral. Heck, it's never even been portrayed in film. In the end, the 4 men killed in 5 seconds gunfight is little more than a footnote in the sordid history of the Wild West. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.